I would suggest, and we do not only here in this book, but also in my general atlases, that to, in this case, use Ukrainian names or the contemporary name in the particular state for places within the borders of Ukraine. So one of those many examples, of course, again, is Lviv. We could use the Yiddish alternatives of Lemberek or Lviv in parentheses, but one shouldn't be referring to the city as Lviv, the Polish form, or Lvov, the Russian form. Also, the historic regions. This is still, I know, in this country a little bit behind. I mean, can you imagine? I still read books. Actually, I'm sitting here with one of the leading specialists in the world on the subject, and he's going to perhaps correct me because I can't remember what he uses in his great monographs, but it seems very strange to use the term Kievan Russia or Carpathian Russia and instead of Kievan Rus, because Rus is not Russia. The point here is being more sensitive to terminology and its consistent use would certainly be of great help in the common efforts that should be used to eliminate unnecessary and at times harmful misperceptions which can be caused by a seemingly benign thing such as nomenclature. Just a few words about this book, Jews and Ukrainians, which reflects some of the conceptual principles that I've just outlined. It's not a history of Jews, nor is it a history of Ukrainians. It's a history of Jews and, pardon, it's not a history. It's a book about Jews and ethnic Ukrainians, but all aspects of their existence. So aside from chapters on geography, there is a chapter on history, one on traditional culture, on beliefs, religion, language, literature, art, architecture, theater, painting, the diaspora. The point being is if you really want to understand a given society, here it's, I don't know if I'm preaching to the choir, but you who are here in the program at Cambridge University are somewhat privileged. Why? Because the approach used to study Ukraine here is driven primarily by culture and not by pure political history, which to my mind is exactly the way to go. But this is not the way it's done in most other places. Because to just try to understand the place through historical development and more often than not sensationalist or major tragedies, you understand very little actually. And so this book doesn't do that, but rather looks at all aspects of Jews and ethnic Ukrainians throughout their roughly 1,000-year presence on this territory, to the degree that they may have interacted or not interacted. And as I said, done in a way that hopefully is an easy read with a sufficient amount of illustrative material to make it literally more visually attractive. So let me stop here if I may.
Perfect. And
any questions, comments, observations that you may have, I will try to do my best to respond to them.
Perfect. Thank you, Professor Magocsi, for, as you said, outlining these conceptual issues, particularly on the question of naming, of language, and then the book itself, and pointing out how, in fact, it's attempting to grapple with these conceptual issues and overcome them in various ways. I think everyone can see, given that the books have been circulating, as well as the maps, of course, that it is indeed sufficient with illustrative material. It's more than sufficient. I can get that.
No, you talk.
So I would like to, of course, open up the floor to questions. We did, of course, think of this setting, even though we're here in the Omni Theater, which is quite a big space. We imagined that it would be a small group. We wanted to make sure that we could have an informal, relaxed exchange. So please feel free to offer your questions or comments. I have, of course, probably too many of them, so I don't want to begin. Yes, please.
When you mentioned the list that another author had compiled of languages spoken by Jews, and how the distinct fact that Ukrainian was left off that list because they called it
just simply Goyish.
Do you think that that's also representative of the relationships between Ukrainians and Jews being distinct when compared to the relationships between Jews and other European ethnicities in the same way? Is there more to read into there?
I think one way to answer that, or to gauge what the motivation behind using a vague term as opposed to an ethnic specific term would be to ask the question whether in the Jewish world, the mindset, there was a specific term for Macedonian, or a specific term, let us say, for maybe even Croatian or Kashubian, or for Breton, or I think there was for Provençal, so I'm going to leave out Occitan here. Where am I going with this, or what is my point? My point is at first glance, probably one of the reasons why in this case Jewish mindset, but it could be applied to some others as well, is that Ukrainian, or Belarusian probably as well, lacked prestige. For all intents and purposes, it didn't exist. Because people think in terms, naturally, of state structures and the culture that goes with that state structure. And so, if a person of Jewish background or intellectual or religious figure, they're living in Muscovy, or then the Russian Empire or the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, the only thing that really counts for them, that is naturally embedded in their mindset, is the dominant culture in which one lives. So I think that, I would suggest, is the reason for not conceiving something Ukrainian as something truly distinct. And that kind of heritage it continues in some circles to the present. And by the way, not only within Jewish circles. I mean, if you lived in the United States, perhaps here, I don't know, because I didn't live here, so I don't know. But if you lived in the United States, not in Canada, Canada is different for a different reason, but in the United States, easily until the late 1980s, if anyone said on the street, in a cab, in a family setting, in a restaurant, someone asks if I'm Ukrainian, the immediate response, literally, but oh, you're from Russia. You know, the concept of Ukraine just simply didn't exist. Why? It's nothing to do with being anti-Ukrainian. It had nothing to do with just, it doesn't exist in the mindset of people who only think in terms of states and are only taught to think in those ways.
I actually would like to follow up on this discussion, and so I'm a trained linguist. So
I'm sorry, you're a trained linguist?
I'm a trained linguist.
Yes?
So whatever I do, I always look at languages. So I want to put on the table two pieces of information. One anecdotal, personal, and another more scholarly. And anecdotal personal is that my family actually does come from Ukraine. And at least in my family, the Jews spoke Yiddish and Russian, never Ukrainian. And the second as actually did my other side of family that came from Latvia, where also they spoke first German and then Russian. So it was never language
Latvian.
of the local. So I think there's a pattern here. And another piece of more kind of scientific information is that in early 90s I read pretty much everything in the archive of Yad Vashem, the Holocaust Institute in Jerusalem, in all Slavic languages that related to testimonies of Jews who passed during the Holocaust for non-Jews. And I was doing it for the professor who did research, and her interest was in different aspects of what helped Jews to actually stay alive. And one of her interests was also linguistic. And so she had, and I also helped her develop the questionnaire. And the interesting thing, and that was even before I knew much more about that, but I remember it very well, is that one thing that really caught my attention is that the Jews who didn't speak local languages had really hard time passing for non-Jews. Those who were caught. But those who did speak kind of local languages, they had much better time. But there were so few of them. But even Polish Jews and Ukrainian Jews, if they spoke any language that was non-Yiddish, that would be Russian. And we're talking about 40s. So I was wondering if, and I absolutely agree, I do think it has had something to do with prestige. Because if Jews were learning non-Jewish, not Hebrew only in Hebrew, right, and Yiddish language, non-Jewish, they would be learning Russian, the language of the empire, at least in the Russian Empire, or German in Habsburg environment. So it's possible that there's something else. It's a prestige, but it's not because Ukrainian is not considered by contemporary scholars and they forget about it as non-prestige language, but at least at this period, it was not really playing into the linguistic dress-up of Jewish population. I'm just, that's a kind of question.
Yeah, and I think that I'm wondering if, to a degree, your anecdotal or personal experience has somewhat of an impact on your scholarly analysis, because yes, it is true that if we just take the territory of the Ukrainian linguistic areal, that yes, it is true that many Jews though living there, and especially those who were urban residents, would not know the language of the rural population, the peasantry, in this case Ukrainian. But that's not all of the Jews in Ukraine, because Jews did not only live in urban areas, they lived in small villages in certain parts of Ukraine. And those who lived in present-day Ukraine, and those who lived in small villages in present-day, within parts of present-day Ukraine, did know the language of, did know what was called Ruthenian at the time, or Rusin, without making any special effort. Well, they were motivated by the fact that if they have business relations with the local population, you got to be able to speak to them. So it's not like no Jews who came from Ukrainian territory didn't know Ukrainian before World War I. After World War I, it's a different story because of educational policy of the Soviet Union, in particular, in the eastern part. I think it's a question here of urban versus rural Jewry in terms of the linguistic issue, is how I would respond to that.
Also, if we think of the 19th century Russian context for a moment, as we know, in 1863, the Ukrainian language is subject to kind of a secretive ban issued by the Minister of the Interior, Pyotr Valuyev. It went into effect in 1863, and around the same time, or maybe afterwards, to what I recall, Valuyev was considering a ban on Yiddish as well,
Mm-hmm.
and the idea was banning Yiddish would force the Jewish communities to either Russian or German. So even German was considered, because of this issue of prestige, an acceptable language for the Jewish community to use
Mm-hmm.
in the Russian Empire. But he felt as though this was kind of a bastardized language, Yiddish was. He didn't succeed, and it was only until kind of after, I think, that they started to put pressure on Yiddish schools and Yiddish theaters toward the end of the century. But that some of the solidarity, given these bans and points of pressure from the empire, led some Jews, and this is to plug our colleague Johanna Petrovsky Stern's book, The Anti-Imperial Choice, The Making of the Ukrainian Jew, toward learning Ukrainian, and in fact writing in Ukrainian. So a number of fantastic examples in Johannan's book include Leonid Pervomaisky, contemporary poet, now quite senior, Moisei Fishbein as well. So there was a kind of an interesting way in which both Yiddish and Ukrainian were subject to pressure. That pressure was largely based on a lack of, or perceived lack of esteem, and that did indeed lead some Jewish cultural figures toward Ukrainian language choice. But it was fairly rare, but it did happen.
And we also have to remember that the Jewish communities themselves, Jewish society themselves, was going through a massive internal debate and struggle between the Yiddishists and the Hebrewists. And clearly the Yiddishists were facing the same criticism of what they were doing as the Ukrainianists were facing from the Russian imperial government, the Russian intelligentsia, and so there was it was a natural affinity between those who favored Yiddish, the poor downtrodden language, and those who favored Ukrainian or Little Russian at the time, the poor downtrodden language.
More questions? Yes.
Okay, so am I to understand then the terms Ukrainian Jews and Jews of Ukraine are not interchangeable? You're not using them interchangeably?
No, you can use them interchangeably. You can say Jews of Ukraine, yes. Yes, Ukrainian Jewry, Ukrainian Jews, or the Jews of Ukraine. All equal, yes. Well, if you understood differently, no, I am using those interchangeably. With basically what I'm saying is that preferable to use those terms than Russian Jew or Soviet Jew, if someone's from the territory of Ukraine.
Yeah, thank you so much. My question is actually a follow-up on the previous question, which is, I am really looking forward to reading this book in detail. But I was wondering, what was your approach towards the definition of Ukrainian and the definition of Jewish in the book before the time when these notions essentially emerged as an ethnic notion or as a civic notion? So how are we to treat periods like the Polish or Lithuanian Commonwealths, the times before that, times immediately after? So I was wondering, what is the method and approach in the book to that?
Again, I'll just repeat very briefly that we are talking about and specifically singling out ethnic Ukrainians when we use the term Ukrainian, and therefore not using the present-day civic identity, because this is a book about the relationships between two peoples, and the civic identity would imply Russians in Ukraine or Crimean Tatars in Ukraine, for that matter, or any other people. So we're making it very clear that the subject here are ethnic Ukrainians. And if one is looking at earlier periods when the term Ukrainian was not used, so we are effectively, when referring to early periods, we are talking about, at least in the 18th century, in the 18th and 19th century in the Russian Empire, so-called Little Russians, Malorossi, or in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, the Rusini, or Ruteni, who lived on the territory of Ukraine, to distinguish them from those who lived in Belarus, because they were also called Rusini, Ruteni. And if one was going back to the medieval period, it's the Rus population who lives on the territory, and that part of Kievan Rus that is now within the boundaries of current Ukraine. So effectively, it's the Rus, Ruteni, Malorossi, Ukrainian. That's the subject of the book, or the subject of one of the peoples that we're talking about in the book.
Can we then label these people Ukrainian Jews, or are these people Russian Jews,
Yeah.
or I'm just...
Yeah, well, you're asking, look, this is an inappropriate question, because things start to get very challenging or problematic. I would say that yes, you could be a Russian Jew if you're born in Ukraine, if you were born and raised, let's say, Moscow or Leningrad, right? And you move for whatever reason to Ukraine, then yeah, one, I guess, in fairness, would say this is a Russian Jew because they're formed in the Russian political and cultural world, and they happen to have moved to Ukraine. If we were going to go one step further, so this family comes from Moscow, of Jewish background, or from somewhere in the Russian world, settles in Ukraine, where they raise their children. By the way, the parents of Petrovsky Stern is an example of this. And that child, however, is born and raised on the territory of Ukraine, then I would call that person a Ukrainian Jew, not a Russian Jew. And in fact, this guy, Johan's career is literally that.
But what if you're born?
I'm sorry.
What if you're born on Ukrainian territory during the Russian Empire?
Yes?
And consider yourself Russian?
Oh, well, then that's what you are.
Even though you're Jewish? And
you are what you are. You are what you
on-
say you are.
Okay. So, then,
But on
does
the-
your history also include the history of Russian Jews on Ukrainian?
Well, yeah, and it also includes. Yes, you notice you started off by saying, well, what a person speaks. What a person speaks is less important than how they identify themselves. As you probably all well know, that we have all of these Russian speakers in Ukraine who are Ukrainian. I mean, who consider themselves Ukrainian, so the language is secondary, distinct from ethnic Russians on the territory of Ukraine, which we have as well.
In the period of the Russian Empire, how at home if you took a Jew from a village in Russia and brought them to a Jewish village in rural Ukraine, how similar are those cultural contexts, or are they somewhat distinct even in the Empire period?
The basis of similarity within the Jewish world, as in other worlds, including the neighboring Ukrainians or neighboring Germans on that territory, was really determined by religious orientation. So, if you were a Hasidic Jew, then you were dealing with your brethren as a fellow Hasidim. On the other hand, there was a major distinction, as I alluded to, between the Litvaks, who weren't Hasidim, and though they were Orthodox but not necessarily Hasidim, and the Hasidim in Ukraine. So this would be the first level of similarity or dissimilarity. And then within the Hasidim, if you belong to one dynasty, then you were not necessarily going to associate with someone who's from another dynasty. Let alone when, in the 18th century, the Haskalah reached Ukrainian lands, or the Neolog movement in Central Europe, from the standpoint of the Hasidim or an Orthodox Jews, these weren't Jews at all. I mean, you know, they felt closer to some Christians actually than they would to these funny Jews or funny people who say they're Jews. Well, no, really not, because how can you be a Jew if you accept the Enlightenment, etc. So that's the. If you had a Hasidic Jew coming from the Russian Empire, he would feel totally comfortable in a Ukrainian village, or for that matter, in an Austro-Hungarian village if they're Hasidim.
Can I just follow up on that? And I was just thinking, for some reason, the figure of Bruno Schulz comes to mind, and I was thinking of his identity, for example, as he quite famously described himself as being at the same time Austrian, Polish Jew. So it's essentially like quantum identity, where it can be all of those things at the same time. And I was wondering, in this respect, how do we, for the purposes of your research, for example, for the purposes of this book, would you describe people like Bruno Schulz as a Ukrainian Jew, even though he himself did not identify as a Ukrainian, or as Ukrainian in any kind of significant way, even though at the moment Drogovich, that was so dear to his heart, is in Ukraine?
Can we trademark this term quantum identity right now? That sounds great.
Well, quantum sounds too scientific. I mean, I have used the term all the time. Multiple identities is the whole approach, the whole explanation of the Ukrainian national movement in the 19th century is based around the idea of state-imposed nationalities, national movements, and intelligentsia-inspired national movements, and within intelligentsia-inspired national movements, when the state is not playing a role, you have the challenge on the part of certainly intellectual leaders as well as followers of those intellectual leaders of the national patriots wanting to struggle against the normal human tendency to have multiple identities of various kinds against mutually exclusive identities. So from that standpoint, in your cultural circles, the quintessential example of multiple identities as the norm in literature, in Ukrainian literature, is Gogol, and mutually exclusive identities is Shevchenko, where we know that Shevchenko wrote in Russian, we know that he thought very often. I'm not talking about language here, I'm talking about perception. I mean, for a Shevchenko or for a Kulish, you couldn't, be, both Russian, Little Russian and Russian. I mean, there's the whole point of this.
Although there are these great exchanges between Kulish and Kostomarov, there are letters in which Kulish says to Kostomarov, why do you keep saying you're hanging out with us only because out of enjoyment? We accept you as Ukrainian. Right. We grant you the right of citizenship. Right. So it kind of saying this tongue in cheek. Right. But even there, they're kind of.
Well, Kostomarov was I didn't mention Kulish, not Kostomarov.
Kostomarov is a little tricky. Kulish is trying to kind of play with these things.
Look, the point is that these guys were starting the process. Certainly by the end of the century, you had people among Ukrainians say, I'm a Ukrainian, period, I'm not a Little Russian. Whereas most of the people had these multiple identities. Yeah, I'm a Little Russian, yeah, I'm also Russian. So this is not, and in the case of a Bruno Schulz, he's of Jewish background, but he functions in a Polish cultural environment, using largely the Polish language, but up until during the Empire, he was a pure Habsburg subject and proud of it, etc. So he has all of these identities. He's completely normal in terms of having multiple identities. If you now want to say quantum identities, fine, whatever. Certainly more than one identity. But you asked the question. Well, would they figure in a book like this? And I would say. As a Jewish writer, and I think I can speak on behalf of my colleague Yohanan Petrovsky-Stan, that as a Jewish writer resident in Ukraine, using different languages, having different identities at different times. He's still Jewish on the present-day territory of Ukraine. He is a legitimate subject of this book.
Can I ask you, even these questions, I think, bring up the question of methodology of naming and the challenge of naming, particularly given these fluid multiple identities changing over the years. And then on top of it, I wanted to ask you a little bit about social history, the fact that groups like Ukrainians and Jews are often, at least in historical scholarship, not well served by the, let's say, a plethora of documents. So we see, a lot of documents from the state, but in terms of texts that actually feature the voice of the Ukrainian peasant or the rural Jew living in Shtetlek throughout this territory, you don't have as much of it. So I wanted to ask you a little bit about the challenge that you and Yohanan faced, or maybe perhaps you didn't face a challenge and you found lots of resources that actually filled in a complete picture for you. But could you comment a little bit about this methodological source-based question? And then, obviously, I think we've talked a good bit about the naming issue, the identity issue, but I'm interested in that kind of textual material source.
Yeah, well, I think the first answer to that question is that this, again, as I said from the very beginning, is not a monograph. It is a book that draws largely, if not exclusively, on secondary literature. Some of us, I know a little bit more about some things than having to depend on secondary literature. He knows a little bit more about some things. I mean, he couldn't probably find anything about Jewish-Ukrainian literary interaction because without consulting the one and only monograph that deals with this, that is the Ukrainians, Jews who write in Ukrainian, and that's his own monograph.
Yeah,
so
yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
but if it wasn't that, then it wouldn't be. Where would he find this? He'd have to go to. So this volume is based primarily on secondary sources. It's not meant to be anything else.
Right.
I mean, after.
But even in terms of your illustrations, the documents that you've kind of presented here in images.
Well, yeah, we do have a little bit of knowledge, more than depending on, as I say, secondary literature. And him for the Jews, me a little bit for Ukraine, to the Ukrainian side of the equation. But you're absolutely true. You're absolutely correct that the kind of source base is not as great as it is in other cultures, but it's not that it's non-existent.
Right.
I mean, and usually you find that just during periods of war. I mean, there's letters that go back and forth from so it's not that it's not there.
Right. But we often think about you mentioned, and I think really rightly, the challenge of a work of this kind, in which you're trying to shed light on the fellowship, let's say, periods of interaction that are not negative, not about pogroms exclusively, for instance. And that tends to be, let's say, sometimes a question of, we could get into state discourse propaganda about, let's say, ancient ethnic hatreds between these groups, etc. But there's also the question of texts and the availability of them, and that's often seemingly a challenge in and of its own right. It's good to know it wasn't a significant one. That's great. Okay, well, any other questions before we conclude? Yes, please, ma'am.
I'm very curious of what happened.
I'm sorry, you're going to have to speak much louder. I'm sorry.
Yes, yes. I'm very curious of the recent repression of Russia towards Ukrainians and all the war going on. Did they play a role inside all of this? Did they try and help, or were they victims? Were they involved in a sense, in a way?
I still have had difficulty hearing you in this room, but if I understand correctly, are you talking about the recent Maidan experience? Or are you talking
about the war in Donbass?
And the war
Jews, did they take a role in this in some way to defend Ukrainians?
Or were they involved in all this?
Well, again, I think what, in terms of contemporary Ukraine, it's no longer contemporary, it's 2013-14, it's already history, that here was a somewhat unexpected, well, no, scratch that. Why should it be unexpected? I'm thinking in stereotypical terms. During the Maidan, we know that external powers, in particular the Russian Federation and the whole propaganda component of it, tried to present to the outside world that the activity in Kiev was an attempt of a putsch overthrowing a legitimate government, and that it was led by people who are fascists and descendants of primarily Western Ukrainians and who are anti-Semitic. The point being trying to get sympathy in the West to be opposed to this Ukrainian revolution. It turns out that from the very beginning, some of the leading figures in the Jewish community in Ukraine, both religious and secular, spoke out very forcefully in favor of the efforts of they themselves and their fellow citizens of Ukraine, of whatever religious or ethnic background, to change the political situation. They are one people, regardless of what their background is. Of course, they're representing Jewish organizations, a whole slew of them. A figure like Joseph Zissels was one of the key spokespersons in this regard, addressing public denunciations of Putin, direct letters to Putin, stay out of our business. What are you talking about? You know, so the people of Jewish background, like people of other backgrounds in Ukraine, were all acting in unison to defend the interests of their country. As one likes to say, all of this largely should be, I guess in the future, there should be some level of thankfulness to Vladimir Putin for all he has done to create Ukraine, to create a civic society, because his activity has motivated Ukrainians as a civic entity to have a greater respect for their own country, having been threatened from the outside.
Were there external forces? I mean, other Jewish, for example, U.S. Jewish, were they corporations?
People like Zissels and well, Rabbi Bleich was the chief rabbi of Kiev, is actually from Brooklyn. So were there external forces? I wouldn't use that term. Was there cooperation and awareness between the Jews of Ukraine and Jews outside Ukraine, whether in Israel or in New York, etc.? Yes, but the motivation did not come from outside. They were standing up for themselves, as citizens of Ukraine, first, to the degree that they could cooperate and call upon moral and other support from fellow Jews in other parts of the world. Yes, that happened as well.
So they were not persecuted by Putin?
They were not specifically?
They were not targeted by Putin?
They were not, no. Well, Putin or the Russian government doesn't target anyone directly. If policy, for instance, in the religious realm, and even beyond the religious realm, that the Russian government wishes to carry out, it's carried out through the Moscow Patriarchate. We know this. And similarly, yes, there was criticism on the part of the leading rabbi in Moscow against Zissels and company. Yes, absolutely, they were very critical of these Ukrainian Jews, and what are they doing, supporting all of these fascists? When we know in Moscow that they are fascists, and they participated in the Holocaust, etc., or their forebears participated in the Holocaust.
let's end on that note, but let's turn it into a more positive one.
Yes, I was going to say, let's not end on that note.
I'll just mention that it's been fascinating for me recently, given that we've been recently celebrating the centenary of the birth of the Ukrainian People's Republic, the so-called Third Universal, published in January 1918, or actually February 1918, was famously published in 4 different languages. And we recently at Cambridge came upon, through work with our colleagues in Cleveland actually,
The Yiddish version.
one of the broadsheets with all 4 languages listed together. Yiddish, Russian, Polish, and Ukrainian. And it's been fascinating to see actually Ukrainians themselves discover this past in which the Jewish language, Jewish culture, and Jewish political activists were very much active in the birth of this Central Rada, for a short period of time. But as another narrative to the one that has often prevailed, in which, of course, one thinks of Khmelnytsky, pogroms, etc.
And Petlura.
And Petlura, and the forces under Petlura, absolutely. Thank you all for coming. Enjoy the sunshine while it lasts. May I please ask you, though, once more to visit the Ukrainian Jewish Encounters website to keep on top of what they're doing, and join me in thanking Professor Paul Robert Magocsi once more.